And I remember going into the room where Srila Prabhupada was, and he didn't have a shirt on at the time. He had just taken his bath and was putting on tilak. And when he saw us, he was very, very happy, and I offered my dandavats. And Gargamuni Maharaj introduced me to Srila Prabhupada. He said, oh, he has given up going to medical school to become a devotee. And he found out that we had just come from East Bengal, where a war was going on. And Srila Prabhupada was very, very grateful. He said that you have risked your life for me and for Lord Chaitanya. And he was so grateful. And he asked me, so you like our books? I said, yes, Srila Prabhupada. And he said, which book do you like the best? And I said, the Bhagavad Gita, as it is. And he said, oh, very good. And as time went by, I went out of the room. And Srila Prabhupada said to Gargamuni Maharaj, after meeting me for the first time, he said, I will make that boy a sannyasi. I was 21 years old.
The first time I met him was in his room at a lunch that Srila Prabhupada cooked. Now this time Srila Prabhupada was cooking for all of his new devotee disciples. There were the first 12 initiated disciples minus one. Kirtanananda was not present at this time. But all the rest of them were. My sister Janki was the first female disciple. So Mukunda warned me, when you meet, we call him Swamiji then, when you meet Swamiji, you can say Hare Krishna, fold your hands like this. So I walked into Srila Prabhupada's quarters, and I remember him sitting in a shaft of light underneath a window. And he didn't have a shirt on. He was dishing out prasadam in this corner. So I said, Hare Krishna, Swamiji. And he said, what is your name? I said, Joan. And he said, so you're from your sister's family? When will the other family members come? I said, I'm the only one. No one else is coming. He said, oh, in India, generally there's a big preparation from the bride side of the family. Never mind. We will celebrate. So that day was my first lunch, and that was a very memorable lunch for a number of reasons. I was a macrobiotic aficionado at that time, and Srila Prabhupada's prasadam was all just power-packed with not only taste, but of course, because his hands had touched it, the way that he served the prasad to the devotees was like no meal I'd ever had. There was so much affection that manifested through Srila Prabhupada's distribution. Another side point, each one of the men ate up to 12 chapatis at a sitting. So that means Srila Prabhupada made a minimum of 144 chapatis for base to start, and then went on with whatever else they wanted to eat. So that was the very first time that I met Srila Prabhupada, that lunch.
My first real direct conversation with Prabhupada was when he was staying over on Formosa, because before the big temple on Watsika, he had separate quarters. Subsequently, he had separate quarters where he'd stay. And I got to go over there, and in fact I remember it was when Neil Armstrong was in the moonshot, and I was there that day at Prabhupada's house. I had the good fortune of having prasadam. If memory serves me, the cook was Kartikeya, and Kartikeya told me he was making the hot chapatis, and he told me how Prabhupada really liked chapatis. Even though he was a small man, he could eat a dozen hot chapatis. And so I finally got to go into Prabhupada's room, and he looked directly at me and said a couple things, and then he said, in your opinion, or by your knowledge, what is God, or who is God? And having been brought up as a Catholic and, greatness, I said, well, the greatest person, and he said, simply God, Krishna is the person who there's no one equal to him or no one greater than him. And if you went everywhere throughout the universes, that would be your experience. So I left there with that understanding. I said, well, today I found out who really is God. It's the person who no one is greater than or no one is equal to. That was my first conversation with the Prabhupada.
So I went in there, and Prabhupada was sitting behind, you know, and he always had these coffee table type desks, and sitting there with one leg up, looked real serene, you know. And so I was real nervous, my hand was shaking, and I gave him the rose and laid down on the floor like the other devotees were doing, and I did my prayers in English, and I couldn't help myself from shaking from being in his presence. And then when we all sat up, there was like 12 new devotees, and Prabhupada said, so you're all very fortunate to come to Lord Chaitanya's movement, and now that you are fortunate, you should make others fortunate. Preach this message to Lord Chaitanya's all over the world. And he went on speaking for like 20 minutes, and he also said that if we served Vishnu, John, and Tamal nicely, that we'd be happy. And so that's the first time I saw Prabhupada. And
for Mahaprabhu's appearance day, I wrote one poem on surrender to Lord Chaitanya. And I gave it to his servant to put on Srila Prabhupada's desk for Mahaprabhu's appearance day. But I didn't sign it. And Srila Prabhupada, I guess, had read it and liked it very, very much. And by process of elimination, he was asking everyone who had written this poem. And by process of elimination, it arrived to me. So he asked me, he called me into the room, and I was sitting with him there alone. And he was very, very sweet and very kind. And he said, so you have written a poem? And I said, yes, Srila Prabhupada. And he said, oh, that's very good. To be poetic is one of the qualities of a Vaishnava. And he said, get a piece of paper and a pencil. And he had written to me a poem. Actually, it was prose, which he entitled 6 Verses on Surrender. And I wrote them down, one after another. And they were very much along the line of Rupa Goswami's teachings. And I still have them, which I have on our altar at home. And during that meeting with Srila Prabhupada, I had the opportunity to speak with him personally and alone. And I could reveal some of the things that were on my mind and in my heart. And I said to Srila Prabhupada, as I had mentioned earlier, that Krishna had revealed himself to me. And that's why I've come to you. And he said, now you must tell them that God is not dead. And then I said to Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada, you're the only person I trust in this world. And Srila Prabhupada looked up at me very kindly and he said, don't trust me. I will let you down. Trust Krishna. He will never let you down.
Well, actually, in those days, we were so inefficient at everything that we did, and so incapable of knowing the significance of what initiation meant. And I remember that, of course, at our fire yagya for the marriage, we we didn't have enough money to buy butter, so we used margarine. And when Srila Prabhupada tried to start the fire, he picked up a piece of wood and he dipped it in. Beautiful. Prabhupada's hands were magnificent, long fingers like this. He picked it up and held it over the flame, and it went. He did it again. Over the fire, no action. So he looked up very grave and said, oh, this marriage will have a very slow start. I was mortified at that. I thought, uh-oh, what have I gotten into now? But yeah, very significant. I suppose at initiation, I do remember very clearly that Srila Prabhupada first gave me the name Kalindi, which is another name of Yamuna. And very quickly, within 10-12 seconds, he said, no, it is Yamuna Devi. And I said, what does that mean, Swamiji? And he said, The river that Krishna sports in Vrindavan is Yamuna.
My first opportunity to have a lot of association with Srila Prabhupada and in private or privately was when I was his driver. And in those days, Sankirtan parties stayed out very late, and everyone was very engaged, and there was really a lot of activity, especially when we acquired that new building, which had been the Methodist church. And I was a Sankirtan leader, but also because not everyone had driving skills or licenses, I also was elected to be Prabhupada's chauffeur in the morning. And like I said, in those days, Sankirtan parties would come back at midnight or 1 a.m., and even later on the weekends, and our Sankirtan leader, the leader, was Vishnu Jana Maharaj, Vishnu Jana. And I came back, we would come back very late, and everyone would get up late too. But somehow I was elected to get up early, like at 5 o'clock, to be ready to promptly, like at 10 minutes to 6, get Prabhupada. We had those little Mavericks, white Mavericks. And for several months, I took Prabhupada alone on his walks. And sometimes, because no one got up early, only Prabhupada was getting up early in those days. And Murlidhar, the artist, got up early, because he didn't go out on the night Sankirtan. He painted. So I was the first person to see Prabhupada in the morning, and we'd go out. And then I really, what the devotees talk about, I got special attention or special consideration. And Prabhupada actually always, every day he would talk, he'd had something to talk about.
Up to that point, Prabhupada never said anything personally to me, except, you know, when he gave me my name in Chicago with a big initiation, and my Gayatri initiation in Vrindavan. So I went all the way, got there, got to the house, and Prabhupada was given darshan at the time. He was sitting in a room smaller than this room here. You know how the Indian houses are there. And he was sitting behind a coffee table. There was a screen door there, and Tamal Krishna Maharaj asked me to pass out sweets to the guests that left. The room was packed with people. And so I just got there, and here I am with a box of sweets at the door, and Prabhupada was just, you know, right there speaking. And so Prabhupada noticed someone outside, and I didn't think anybody else could fit in the room because they were all sitting like this, you know. The room was packed, and Prabhupada asked me to let him in. And so when I opened the door to let him in, another person went out the door at the same time he came in, and they kind of crossed, and I didn't give him prasadam. So Prabhupada asked me, "Did you give him prasadam?" And I said, "Well, no, Prabhupada, you know." And Prabhupada said, "This boy is incompetent." He turned to Tamal, and Tamal says, "All right, Gauridas, go downstairs and I'll talk to you later." Yeah. And so I thought, I'm finished, that's it. You know, I gave my whole life to Prabhupada, and I thought, I displeased the spiritual master, I'm going to get sent to Africa, back to Bombay. So the Ganges was right there, this house was on the bank of the Ganges. And I went down to the Ganges, and I was remembering Vishnu Jan Swami, the story about him. That's another one I can tell in a little bit. And so I was sitting there on a rock in the river, and I was thinking I should just drown myself right now. You know, I was crying. And about 20 minutes later, Tamal came down, Tamal Krishna Maharaj, and he kind of laughed. And he said, "Gauridas, don't take it so seriously. Go up and clean Prabhupada's room." And I was surprised because I thought he was going to send me, and he had that authority to do that. And so I, you know, washed my face and straightened my dhoti up, and went into Prabhupada's room, and it was just Prabhupada still sitting there, and Upendra was the only one there. And he gave me a broom, and he said, sweep the floor here. So I started sweeping, and I felt really like, really ashamed that I was such a fool. And but I felt like Prabhupada was looking at me. So I looked over at him, and he just smiled like anything. And I just, wow, you know, all that anxiety just went, and Jai Prabhupada, and I started sweeping real fast.
I asked Srila Prabhupada for initiation, and he did the fire sacrifice, and there was Tushta Krishna and myself, and Tushta Krishna actually had come from Hawaii and was with Siddhaswarup at the time, and some of his followers had come to take initiation from Srila Prabhupada. And the fire sacrifice, after being done by Prabhupada, he gave us our names. And he named Tushta Krishna. He said, one who is satisfied with Krishna. And he gave me my name, and he said, Pusta Krishna, you are Pusta Krishna. Pusta means strength, one who gets strength from Krishna. And he was really amused, I think, by the names, Tushta Krishna and Pusta Krishna. And the next morning on the morning walk, he was very jubilant. And he looked at me and he said, Pusta Krishna. And I said to Srila Prabhupada, thank you for giving me a name. And then he became very grave. So I understood at that time that Srila Prabhupada could be a little bit unpredictable, and that one had to be grave in his presence, and I always tried to be.
Morning walks were one of the most relishable aspects of spending time with Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada gave us access to spend time with him all day and into the night. But for me, in that early San Francisco period, I generally was one of the ones that wanted to be on that morning walk. And one of the early devotees and I used to get up at 2 in the morning and go to Golden Gate Park and pick flowers in Rhododendron Dell, make garlands for Srila Prabhupada, and then present them to Srila Prabhupada, go on the morning walk. It was in the park. And they were always very, very special moments for us, to walk next to your spiritual master, to try to chant Hare Krishna as he is chanting Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada was always chanting Hare Krishna. His hand was in his bead bag, if he was sitting in his rocking chair or behind his desk when he wasn't writing. So certainly the morning walks, they were japa walks, and he walked very briskly. Srila Prabhupada walked like a young man of 25. I remember I had wooden yogi shoes between the toes, and the first day I went for a walk with those shoes on, my feet bled because Prabhupada was just snapping right along very fast. Yeah, morning walks were glorious with Srila Prabhupada.
One morning we were driving. We always drove down Venice. And we always went to Santa Monica Beach. Once I told Prabhupada about La Brea, the tar pits, and we went over there, and he liked walking around there. But one morning, it's about 6 a.m., and not a lot of movement yet on the streets, and a biker who had a shaved head, looked like had a Harley chopper and everything, he was driving down Venice Boulevard. He looked over and he looked in the car, and I had a shaved head, and Prabhupada had a shaved head, and he had pretty much shaved head, and he looked like a gnarly biker, right? But all of a sudden he started staying with us, and then he went right behind us, and I was like a little concerned, you know. And he was kind of like singling with us and trying to communicate with us. He followed us all the way down to the beach. He parked behind us and came up and asked if he could walk with us, you know. And Prabhupada said yes. And Prabhupada talked to me, and the guy just walked along, and after about halfway through the walk, he turned around and left us. And I was, many times I found that certain situations were provoking or intimidating, but Prabhupada was so in control, and it rubbed off a little bit. I was like, oh, what's this guy going to do? And then Prabhupada was, yes, you may walk with us, please come. And he would stop, and he would stop as he would when he was walking, and he'd have his cane, and he'd look at you directly in the eyes, and he looked at that guy in the eyes also. And he was explaining about, when you were with Prabhupada on the oceans, then it was deep philosophy, it was intellectual, because the element, the gigantic ocean, it's like Vishnu, Mahavishnu, Kiradakshay Vishnu. So whenever you saw in some of the materials, the ocean walks brought out some of the best, times, discussion-wise. And Prabhupada would always be explaining, for example, how the material civilization had sprung up, and how the ocean had always been there, and the ocean always comes to this point, bar some tremor or an earthquake or disturbance, and the civilization comes to this point. And he was explaining this to this biker also, and it was just, it was incredible. About halfway through, the guy left, and Prabhupada just didn't notice it and kept on going.
I got to go on a few morning walks with him there in Hawaii. He'd go to Magic Island and walk out there, and you can get out to the point where you can see the surfers, because it goes way out, and the surfers right there. And he stood there one day and he said, they're sea sufferers. They're preparing to take sharks and dolphin bodies. And then another day he said, like a day or two after that, he said, they have mystic power, they're walking on water. I cannot do that. There is a lot of nice stories actually in Hawaii. He walked through the prasadam room and he saw a grain of rice on the floor. And he said, whoever has spilled that rice will have to suffer. That's Krishna. Prasadam should not be wasted. Another time, Sukadeva was cooking for Prabhupada. And he was by his desk. You should probably get some pastimes from Sukadeva. He tells the story real well. But he caught a bug, and he asked Prabhupada, Prabhupada, what should I do with this bug? And Prabhupada said, take him to the window. And so, Sukadeva says, who can you ask anybody else what to do with a bug? They'd think you're crazy, but Prabhupada, you could ask him anything like. And, so they asked him if they could spray the cockroaches in the temple. And Prabhupada said, no, it's simply you're unclean, you're lazy, so you don't want to clean, so you want to just leave it dirty, then just keep killing the cockroaches. So he didn't want, unless it was this, extreme, really extreme emergency, he didn't want. And that reminds me of another story in Bombay. I just became Prabhupada's servant, and Tamal was asking him, what about mosquitoes? Can we kill mosquitoes? And Prabhupada said, only if they're biting you. If they're biting you, you can kill them, but before that, you can't kill them.
There was one occasion when we were flying from Singapore to Australia, and Hari Story was his personal servant at the time. They were seated up in the first class section, and I was seated in the back in the coach section. And the plane must have hit an air pocket or something, and it seemed to drop very, very quickly, maybe 5,000 or 10,000 feet, it seemed like. My stomach was in my head, that's all I could think of. And it was like going down a roller coaster, but it was a huge roller coaster because it just continued for about 5 or 10 seconds. And I remember getting up, and I was pretty shaken, although I was chanting at the time. And walking up to Srila Prabhupada in the front cabin and asking him if he was all right. And he looked like nothing had happened at all. And I asked Srila Prabhupada, are you okay? And Srila Prabhupada said, yes, we can die at any time.
The first day that I assisted Srila Prabhupada in the kitchen was for my sister's wedding in New York. And Srila Prabhupada cooked in a very small galley kitchen in his New York apartment, both sides counters. And he gave me the singular task of making a very difficult preparation called aloo kachori, which is still my Waterloo, because it's one of the most complex pastries to cook properly. It has to cook for a long time without becoming greasy, and that's almost impossible. It's like the elephant through the eye of a needle at the best of circumstances. But because the stuffing for this is mashed potatoes, it is even more difficult. If it's a pea kachori that can blow up like a stuffed puri, then it's easy. This is very difficult. So for nearly 8 hours, I was given that singular task of making aloo kachoris, while Srila Prabhupada cooked a 14-course feast for the wedding single-handedly in his kitchen. And in the course of cooking that feast, I made so many mistakes from the very first day in his service. The first mistake I made was I had a very short skirt on and little t-shirt and sitting cross-legged, and And I said, Swamiji, may I have a cigarette? And he popped his head out the corner and he said, go wash your hands. So I went and washed my hands. And so then he explained the 4 principles in Krishna consciousness. 4 prohibitions, and no meat eating, no gambling, no illicit sex life, no intoxication. So then, short time later, I said, Swamiji, may I have a glass of water? And he said, go wash your hands. So then he explained the first and simple, foremost principle in cooking is to engage the senses in the service of the Lord, to cook for Krishna with love and devotion, and not think about our senses, our tongue, our sense of smell, the belly. This is cooking for Krishna. So then short time later I said, Swamiji, it's very hot in here. I was wiping perspiration. Go wash your hands. So then he began a little bit, the simplest principles, rudimentary principles of external cleanliness. And then he explained just the simplest touch of internal cleanliness. By balancing both of them, are we able to engage in the idea of serving Krishna through this art of cooking. So all 3 things, first day in the kitchen.
I used to be a real fancy chamra fanner. I'd do the cheddar, I'd get up there, and I thought I was the best chamra guy. And so then that's what I was doing for Prabhupada in the garden. 2 or 3 hours every morning I'd fan him with the chamra. And so one morning, Prabhupada, he had 3 sets of japa beads, a little one, a medium one, and a real big one. And we had them all there by his vyasasana, and he'd pick out whatever one he wanted that day. So he was sitting there chanting, and his eyes were shut, and a fly landed right above his lip here. And I thought, oh, what am I going to do? So I took my finger and I got real close to him without touching him, and I was going like that, but the fly just kept walking around, and he wouldn't leave. And so after a minute, Prabhupada opened one eye and looked at me, and I jumped back a little bit, because I was kind of close to him. And he said, you are fanning around the world, but you can't get the fly off my face. Give me that chamra. And so he took the chamra, and he said, do like this, and he fanned it right on his face. And so a few minutes later, it happened again, a fly landed, and I was a little bit hesitant, but I brushed it on his face, and then he nodded and said, yes, very nice.
So we were flying from Mauritius to Durban, and it was a Qantas airline that was coming from Perth, Australia, and there was some type of a rugby match that had taken place with the South African and New Zealand teams at that time, and there were a lot of rugby types on the plane. And we had a seat in the non-smoking section. And I was seated beside Srila Prabhupada, and there I was with my little British hat and shirt and coat and pants. And people were smoking in the non-smoking section. And of course I was disturbed by it because I didn't like it. But I was also concerned for Srila Prabhupada's welfare. And so I asked one of the stewardesses, could you please ask them to not smoke? This is a no smoking section. So she informed the rugby type guys who were drinking quite a bit as well to stop smoking. And of course they didn't stop smoking. So I again went to inform the stewardess, can you please ask them again? And Prabhupada stopped me. He said, what is the difference between us and them if we can't tolerate these sort of things? He said, don't be an ordinary, common, foolish man.
I always had an attraction to Vrindavan. And as early as 1967, I wanted to go to Vrindavan. So I remember one morning, we were on a morning walk with Srila Prabhupada. I believe that was around Stowe Lake. And I was walking right next to Srila Prabhupada. And he stopped. He put out his cane, he was leaning on his cane. And he said, so, we have received a letter from Achyutananda and he wants some men to join his party in Lucknow. So I immediately popped up, said, I'd like to go, Srila Prabhupada. May we go? May Gauridas and I go? He said, yes, maybe we can arrange that. We will start an American house in Lucknow. Then we walked a little farther. Then he said, no, you should not go now. And he turned around and he said, someday I will take you to India on foot. I will show you India on foot. So from that moment I was waiting for that day that would come. And that came about 3 years later, 1970, October 4th. Our party of American and European devotees landed in Bombay, and a party had just a few days earlier arrived in Calcutta via Tokyo, some swamis. And in that fall between October 4th and Srila Prabhupada leaving India in the spring of 71, in so many places he showed us India on foot, literally walking on foot through the streets.
And devotees would about be doing the magazines, and I would be with the books, and I'd invariably sell a few or several, and every night, especially Prabhupada would stay up very late, so sometimes we'd come back at 11:30 or something, and Gargan would say, Prabhupada wants to talk to you, and I'd run up, and he'd say, how many books did you sell, and how did it go, and who were the people, and what did you say to sell them? So that was interesting. In those days, later on in Sankirtan, people were wearing karmi clothes, or normal clothes, or wearing wigs and disguising it. In those days, we never thought about that, and I used to always tell the people exactly what I'd been hearing in the classes, that this was the Bible from India, and it would explain to you better about your past lives and goals. But Prabhupada, he was very specific. I mean, my recollections of Prabhupada, he was such a detailed person. Nothing escaped him. And if you just said something, and if it was lacking a little bit of substance, Prabhupada wanted to know what I was telling people. And he approved. I mean, I was listening in the classes in the morning, and I was saying things I was hearing, and he approved. But he wanted to know precisely what I was telling people and how it was that I was able to move those books and things like that.
The temple room was full of devotees, and one of the big book distributors asked Prabhupada, kind of a pointed question, Prabhupada, what pleases you the most? And Prabhupada said that if you develop your love for Krishna, that will please me the most. And all the devotees, the cooks, the pujaris, everyone, Jai Prabhupada. So that was real nice to hear that.
Buddhimanta especially, rest his soul, was going out onto the streets, and of course he was a very imposing figure. He was very tall and big and bright-faced. He appeared somewhat crazed, I would say. But he was distributing incense, and he was begging for money, really, in a way that we had never done before. But he was collecting a lot of money to help bring this dream about. And I had some differences of opinion about how the money should be collected. Who was I? I mean, I was just really traveling through. But I made it known to some of the devotees that I thought maybe a monk shouldn't act like that. And it was really a bone of contention between Bali Mardana and myself at the time. Of course, we've reconciled that since then. But he called up Srila Prabhupada and talked to Shyam Sundar and objected to my objecting to the way that they were collecting money. And Srila Prabhupada wrote a very instructive letter back. And he didn't criticize either of us. He didn't say, you're right and you're wrong. Either way, that wasn't his concern at all. He simply said, I just want that you should all be able to get along together. And I think that's very instructive, because we had different ideas about how devotional service should be carried out. And Prabhupada wasn't about to take sides. He rather wanted us to simply work together harmoniously. And it's something that's taken me a long time to understand. But I think that it tells something of his character, that he was more concerned about us working as a family than he was about crediting someone as being right or wrong.
The first San Francisco temple had certain similarities to the first New York temple, but then quite a few dissimilarities. The first being that in New York there were very few women. In San Francisco there was almost an equal balance of men and women. So already the chemistry of the temple was different. But in most places we were like Srila Prabhupada's children. I think the rasa of being children was foremost, although when one studies the letters of this period, we'll also find that sometimes Srila Prabhupada referred to us as his sons and daughters, and sometimes mothers and fathers. He let the role reverse for intimacy. But I think there isn't a devotee from these times, from the early days, who did not feel that every moment with Srila Prabhupada was intimate. Srila Prabhupada had such a way of showing a love and affection through distributing Krishna consciousness that immediately we felt he was the only object of. I'd never known what love was until I met Srila Prabhupada, and I think that was true for all of us. We learned to love each other through Srila Prabhupada, and we had very deep, wonderful, transcendental relationships between each other as God brothers and God sisters. And Srila Prabhupada was the father. That was the mood, at least in our San Francisco temple, and that was slightly different from New York. Because, again, there was a mix of the boys and girls. He called us boys and girls. And we were. Most of us were in our 20s. Between 25 and 30 was the average age of our San Francisco temple.
He was sitting in the garden. He used to, in the morning, Prabhupada would either chant, listen to kirtan, have letters read to him by Tamal, and he would dictate a response. Tamal would type out the letter, and then Prabhupada, he would read the letter to Prabhupada the next day, and Prabhupada would sign the letter. So something like that was usually going on. So this day Tamal was sitting there, and he got up and left the garden. And Prabhupada noticed the keys were there. He left the keys, and he told me to give me those keys. So I picked up the keys. I was fanning him with the charmer. That was my duty in the garden every day for like 2 or 3 hours, as long as he stayed in the garden, from like 6:30 to about 9:30. He'd sit in the garden with the fountain running. The fountain always had to be running. He was very fond of the fountain and the sound it made, very serene. And yeah, there's a whole lot of garden stories too. But so he put the keys under his dhoti there, and he told me to go get Tamal. So I ran out in the front, and I said, Prabhupada wants to see you. And he came out, and Prabhupada said, I want my sapphire ring out of the safe. And so Tamal goes, feels for his keys and looks around, and he goes, okay, Prabhupada, and he goes off. And then about 5 minutes later, Prabhupada said, go get Tamal again. So I went out in the front, and Tamal was like, looking, tearing up his office, looking for the keys, and he said, Gauridas, have you seen my keys? And I didn't want to lie to a sannyasi, so I just threw my hands up and looked kind of dumb. And so I said, Prabhupada wants to see you now, and he goes, oh, run up to the bathroom and see if I left the keys up there. And I said, I can't leave Prabhupada alone that long. I have to go back out there. So he comes out again, and Prabhupada said, where's my ring? And he said, I'm just now getting it, Prabhupada, I'll be right back. And so he goes off again, and Prabhupada shook his head, and looks at me, kind of smiles, and then he waited a few more minutes, and he goes, go get Tamal again, the third time. So I got him, and Prabhupada said, where's my ring? And he started to make another excuse. And Prabhupada pulled the keys out and dangled them in front of him, and he goes, here, you rascal. If anything is stolen, it's your fault for giving him the chance. So Prabhupada was very secure. Everything had to be locked in the safe. He was very secure conscious. He said also one time that I have millions of dollars, but I don't waste one farthing of Krishna's money, which reminds me of another story where Upindra got chastised. He sent Upindra to the store to get an eye washer, the little glass. They put rose water in it, and you put it in your eye, rinse it out. And so Prabhupada at the time was very sick, and he was getting some mucus in his eyes. And so Upindra went And Prabhupada, he got back, Prabhupada asked him, how much did you pay for the eye washer? And he said 4 rupees, which at the time was only, it was 8 rupees to $1, it was like 25 cents. So Prabhupada said, 4 rupees? He goes, it's only worth 1 rupee. It should have been 1 rupee, maybe 2 rupees, but you have spent 4 rupees. You've wasted Krishna's money. And it just blasted him for 20 minutes, and Upendra was just like, totally fried, you know. Whenever Prabhupada chastised, wow, it was so heavy. Guru, you know, guru means heavy, so. But then the thing, like my experience in Rishikesh, he chastised you 1 minute, but he didn't do it begrudgingly, and the next minute he'd smile at you. And he only did it when it was, when the disciple could take it. So, yeah, Prabhupada didn't want to see any money wasted.
There was an instance in South Africa where, again, I was his acting secretary at the time. The 5th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam had just been printed, and the first copies were sent by air express to him in Johannesburg. And Bhargava had been traveling with Srila Prabhupada, taking pictures of the programs that Srila Prabhupada was putting on. And it was the night of a very big program in Pretoria. And Srila Prabhupada had received this box of books, and in fact there are some photographs you'll see of Srila Prabhupada sitting in a room looking at the 5th canto, and there's orange and white tile on the floor. That was the house that we had converted into a temple in Johannesburg. Srila Prabhupada opened up the books and was looking at them, and he was so happy to see the 5th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam printed, and he was relishing it. And Bhargava was doing his job. He was taking picture after picture after picture, snap, snap, snap. From a distance, he wasn't getting in Srila Prabhupada's way. But Srila Prabhupada said, in a very angry way, why are you always taking so many pictures? And Bhargava Prabhu was very saddened and sheepish about the comment. How can I say this? He felt very bad, as if he had been chastised by Srila Prabhupada. He walked out of the room, and Bhargava walked out of the temple. And we had a program that night. And after Srila Prabhupada had said that, Bhargava had gone, and he's in Johannesburg, South Africa. And all Prabhupada could think about is, where is Bhargava? Where is Bhargava? Why has he done this? He was so concerned about him. It was such a sweet thing that was going on. Bhargava, of course, I've told him about this later, but he doesn't realize how concerned Srila Prabhupada was about him. And we went to the program. Bhargava wasn't there. And then after the program, all Prabhupada could talk about was Bhargava. In the car, where is Bhargava? Why has he done this? And I said, Srila Prabhupada will go out looking for him. And it was about midnight. And we got a call. And it was Bhargava. And he felt so terrible that he had angered Srila Prabhupada by taking so many pictures. And I said, stay right where you are. I'll go pick you up. Srila Prabhupada wants to see you in the worst way. So we went and picked up Srila Prabhupada. So we went and picked up Bhargava Prabhu and brought him to Srila Prabhupada. And Srila Prabhupada, like a loving father, had such a beautiful interaction with Bhargava. He said, I don't want you to feel like this. I just don't want you to always take pictures of me. Why always me taking pictures? Here are the books. And I think it showed the character that Srila Prabhupada had of what he really wanted. He didn't want a cult made out of him, that people should always take pictures of him. Of course, he's a spiritual master, but he's really the most humble servant of the Lord. He's playing the role of spiritual master only because of necessity to serve his spiritual master. But in reality, the only thing that he wanted was to magnify Krishna for everybody.
San Francisco Temple, on one occasion Prabhupada came for Rath Yatra, and I had more responsibility in that time. we had a devotee there, you know, Chandanacharya, and he was a householder in a temple which was mostly brahmachari, almost entirely. But he was very good. He did everything possible to help the devotees, and he was right there with us. But Chandan could imitate Prabhupada's voice. I mean, you couldn't tell. If he wanted to do it to you on the telephone or something like that, and you thought you were talking to Prabhupada by the way he would, the Bengali voice. And he used to get me in trouble with that because he knew that he could fool me. And one time, Shyama called me from London and gave me some big news that it was George Harrison had agreed to help purchase the temple and the book, and I was supposed to immediately give the news for Prabhupada. So Prabhupada was staying over in our temple in Berkeley, and I was in San Francisco. I knew Chandan was over there, and somebody answered the phone. I said, okay, I need to talk to Prabhupada. I have a message for him. Well, you know, it takes a little while at the temple. The phone's downstairs, and Prabhupada, I knew his guest room was up on top of the Berkeley temple. And immediately someone picked up the phone, and I knew Chandan was over there, and started saying, yes, what is it, what's the, you know, and I said, Chandan, please. I said, I'm calling to talk to Prabhupada, just get off the phone. And took second time, then Prabhupada said, what are you talking about? I said, Chandan, come on, this is serious business. Then Prabhupada got mad and yelled at me on the phone. He said, this is Prabhupada, this is A.C. Bhaktivedanta, what do you want to say? You know? I said, oh, excuse me, Prabhupada. And then I got the message out. Oh, you don't know, I felt like, and he said, oh, very good, that's very good. I felt relieved, but I felt like such an idiot.
I remember he was lecturing. Unfortunately, we do not have tapes from this period. Srila Prabhupada was recorded. I recorded with my little tape recorder. Gargamuni recorded when he came. And Hayagriva recorded. And out of all the recordings taken at this time, the only tapes that survived are the Krishna Leela tapes with Hayagriva, with Golden Avatar. So many of those have been lost. But he was lecturing on, not the TLC, but the Chaitanya Charitamrita. I remember after some very considerable amount of time, one of the devotees asked, so, who is Lord Chaitanya? And Prabhupada said, oh, such a nice, intelligent question. You are so intelligent for asking this question. And this is the subject matter of his lecture for several days. So he was so patient with us. Whether we fell asleep or we cried, somehow or another we begin to hear what is this Krishna consciousness. But most of us tasted our Krishna consciousness through chanting, dancing, and feasting. I think that's what we had senses for engaging in the most in those early days.
So Yashodananda was reading to him. He asked him, Prabhupada, how is it that you wrote these books yourself? Why is it that you like to hear them again? You know what these books are. He said, I did not write these books. Krishna wrote these books. One day he was reading, I believe it was the Sri Upanishad, and Prabhupada asked him to read that last paragraph again. And he read it again. And Prabhupada said, these are not my words. They're changing my words. Write them immediately and tell them, do not change my words. He turned to Tamal and he said, is my English not good? And Tamal said, your English is perfect, Prabhupada. And he said, then why are they changing? He said, do not become like a leapfrog and try to jump over your spiritual master. This is the worst thing a disciple can do. Write them immediately and tell them, do not change my books. And he got very angry. It was the angriest I ever saw Prabhupada get. So it was very important that Prabhupada wanted only spelling errors, grammatical errors to be changed and nothing else. One time we carried Prabhupada, they were building the Gurukul in Vrindavan in 77, the last year there. And so we carried him in the rocking chair up to take a tour of it. And as we were going through the different areas, the devotee would say, this is my room, Prabhupada. Another one, this is my room, Prabhupada, and this is for this. Prabhupada got mad and he said, you're all so concerned about yourselves, your own rooms. I built this school for the kids. Fill it up. Fill it up with students. This is for the students. And he got upset about that. Then as we were carrying him back to his room, when we went by, we were carrying him in the chair, they were chanting in the temple room. They knew Prabhupada was going by. So they're, Jai Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada. Prabhupada said, what are they chanting? And we said, they're chanting Jai Prabhupada. And he said, I do not like this. Tell them to chant Hare Krishna. So, I mean, it's okay a few times, but he didn't want it to go on and on and on and on. He never did that.
Later in one letter that I had received from Srila Prabhupada, I had informed him that I was going to get married. And he gave me his blessings. And he said, but above all, continue to follow the 4 regulative principles and chant 16 rounds of Hare Krishna mantra every day. That will protect you. And he said, my only request is that you don't become an ordinary, common, foolish man. He wasn't concerned that one was a sannyasi or a grihasta. And he frankly said in the letter that these things, of course, even by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, are considered external. But that he was concerned about, that we didn't become common, foolish men, but remained very high-minded and Vaishnavas.
Srila Prabhupada liked anything that was well prepared. He tried to teach us technique, procedure, quality, cleanliness, purity, in simple ways. He didn't teach with a lot of words, he taught by example. And of course, he had personal favorites. At this time, Srila Prabhupada was had a little tummy, and he was eating immense quantities of rice. Sometimes we would feed a very large thali, and he would finish off most of that thali, leave a little maha for us. But the things that he taught us were generally fatty and juicy and sweet and succulent and very sumptuous. That was the era of sumptuous prasad, because he felt if he could catch us through the tongue doing 2 things, vibrating and respecting, if he could capture us through those 2 ways, then we would begin to taste more and more of Krishna consciousness. So the food was sumptuous and rich.
When he came to Rath Yatra, I took pleasure in cooking. I wanted to make something very nice. And his servant told me that he liked okra. And I was clued in on the secrets of preparing okra so it doesn't become too, that viscosity that comes with it, and how to dry it and cut it properly. And I remember there were a bunch of devotees, and we started cooking. Bhutatma was around then, and Krishnadas was there. And we made some very special preparations, and we made some, I remember I made this preparation with macadamia nut halava with cream, and I made some fancy rice and with gold leaf on it, the edible type. And all the devotees were saying, wow, we can't wait to get maha from this. And it came down empty. And it's, boy, Prabhupada really liked that. He ate everything. He really liked the okra, and every bit of it was gone. I felt like that was it. That was the apex of my life. That I cooked and it was good, that nothing came back down to be distributed. Yeah.
Another pastime in Hawaii is, Hawaii is very nice and tropical, so the devotees would bring Prabhupada a lot of fruits, nice, lilikoi, passion fruit, but his favorite, of course, is the mango. And so there's like 40 varieties of mangoes in Hawaii. And so the devotee asked Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada, what kind of mango do you prefer? We have so many kinds here. Which kind do you want me to bring you? And Prabhupada said, the ones from the eastern side of the tree. He didn't really care the brand, but the eastern side of the tree, because it gets the morning sun. He explained, and the morning sun gives the prana and is the best fruit.
In Europe, I spent a lot of time initially preaching in Paris, and Srila Prabhupada was invited to come to Paris, and then we went on to Geneva, where we were starting a preaching program. And Guru Garanga had arranged for a hall to have some program. And I remember Bhagavan was there, and We were sitting on the stage after having had a kirtan with this very so-called sophisticated Swiss audience. And one person got up and asked the question, why are you vegetarians? And at that time, Srila Prabhupada's reply was, why don't you eat your sister? When I heard that, I looked at Bhagavan, and Bhagavan went like this. Like, oh no, how are we going to get out of this one? And then Prabhupada went on to explain, why can't you discriminate? And what he was saying, I think, was very extreme, of course. But what he was saying is that human life, and eating included, involves discrimination. And while he took an extreme position, it was very instructive, at least to the devotees, although some of the devotees didn't know how to take it at the time. But Srila Prabhupada could do that. He could sometimes be very shocking to make a point. And one thing is very sure, that we could never really predict how Srila Prabhupada was going to answer a question. And sometimes he would answer the same question differently because of the circumstances. And we'll never understand how or why, but we can appreciate Srila Prabhupada's character.
On that day I made very Bengali food and served it in a Bengali fashion, arranged on the thali in a Bengali order. And Srila Prabhupada's sleeping room is where he respected. And so he sat behind his desk, and Pishima, we gave a small chunky. She sat it just directly opposite Srila Prabhupada on the floor. So as soon as I brought the thalis in and sat them down, Srila Prabhupada started making these little comical remarks about his sister. And he said, you know, she says it is water, I say it is fat. And I thought, my goodness, he's talking about her weight. You know, what's going on? And she, as soon as Prabhupada started kind of being light in his voice, Pishima kind of started chuckling. You know, she started kind of laughing on the side. And he said, all this. And he went like this. He was flapping his arm back. He said, this is fat, he said. But she calls it water. It's not so. And then he started teasing her. He started telling her about, oh goodness, the days when in their childhood they used to fly kites. And he said, I always used to beat her at kites, he said. And back and forth he was speaking very brother-sisterly about his little sister. So she was laughing, not understanding a word of all this. And in the course of all this kind of jesting, I was bringing the chapatis in, relays of chapatis. And when Srila Prabhupada finished his meal, I noticed that every katori, the little round bowls that all of the moist preparations that are in and serving a thali, they were now piled one on top of the other, from the largest to the smallest, nearly 12 inches high, on top of his chunky. And when I walked in the room, he took his finger like this and he knocked down the whole stack. And he said, Yamuna Mai ki jai. And I said, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. And Pishima said, Gauridas ki jai. And I said, oh, Srila Prabhupada, you ate everything. He said, now this was a speech that the two of us had with each other. Srila Prabhupada and I had signals for what the quality of the prasad was. Already now things had evolved much from the very early days. And if he patted his stomach, that meant it was third class. If he went like this, second class. If he went like this, first class. This meant excellent. So he said like that, excellent. And in this way, I remember very light, sweet, jovial, humorous first meeting with Pishima, where she didn't understand a word of what was going on, but she truly loved it. She was very, very fond of Srila Prabhupada, and from that day that I met her until very last that she was with Srila Prabhupada in 1976. I was also present in Vrindavan. She worshipped him. She just worshipped her brother. And he obviously was very, very fond of her.
Every day, Upendra and sometimes Bhakti Chur would cook Prabhupada's lunch, and they'd toil away in the kitchen for like 3 hours, making everything so nice. And then Upendra would bring the plate to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada would just wave it off, distribute. Sometimes I would distribute the plate. And Prabhupada, one time, he saw the devotees point, and I want this, I want that. Prabhupada said, mix it all together, they should not discriminate. So I mushed it all together, sweets and vegetables and rice and everything into a big mishmash. And then the devotees were like making faces, and Prabhupada said you shouldn't discriminate if here's the maha if you want it or not. And but every day, Upendra was toiling to bring this plate, big plate, huge plate, probably 16 inches across, round, and 5 kinds of vegetables, fancy rice, bitter melon, lemon, ginger, make everything really nice, and Prabhupada just distribute. This went on for like a whole month, about the month of June. And near Jali Ekadasi came up, and I fasted all day, Upendra fasted all day, and it was like 110 degrees at that time. So the next morning I was just so weak. Even that day during the evening, I was just about ready to, my knees were going to buckle. I felt like, how can I continue this? But somehow or another I did it. And so the next day when Upendra brought Prabhupada's plate and Prabhupada waved it off, Upendra just couldn't believe it. He said, Prabhupada, how is it? We're young boys, and if we fast for one day, we can hardly move. And here you are fasting for 30 days now. How do you do it? And Prabhupada said, I am living proof that the soul is not dependent on the body for subsistence, but rather the body is dependent on the soul. And so it's like, we were just overwhelmed with, even though Prabhupada was getting ready to leave the planet, he's still so Krishna conscious and free from bodily designation.
During Prabhupada's lecture, he basically stressed what he also stressed to me in a letter shortly after I took sannyas, which was to study the philosophy. He was very concerned that we understand the philosophy very thoroughly. And he said to me, do just like I'm doing. Just like sometimes I'm managing, sometimes I'm preaching, sometimes I'm cooking, sometimes cleaning, like that. Whatever needs to be done, that's sannyas. And it was very instructive because he was teaching yukta vairagya, that real renunciation is to do whatever is required for the service of Krishna, and not to maintain a false posture of being very aloof, as if one is only a preacher.
With Nagar Kirtan, with our congregational chanting, it was the joy of watching Srila Prabhupada pray to Krishna, because I think I explained a little earlier that when Srila Prabhupada first introduced the kirtans in our temple, first he sang. In the evening, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings, he sang Mangala Charana, alone. And we all were the rhythm section behind that. Our San Francisco was temple was a very musical place. We had so many instruments, and everyone played an instrument. Nobody sat in the temple. Everyone played something. It was a very reciprocal relationship with Srila Prabhupada. And he sat on his Vyasasan and he closed his eyes almost always when he sang this Mangalacharana, and he went very deep into prayer. And when he opened his eyes, gray slits moist, and he looked down at us, it was very often as if you felt as if Srila Prabhupada was looking right through you, seeing everything, seeing Krishna. So by simply observing him pray to Krishna, we got an idea of the depth of what prayer was, even in these early days. And then the kirtans were simply rock-out sessions. I mean, if one person stood, everyone stood. If another person danced, you danced, because we were all packed right in together. And they were very joyous, beautiful, joyous, long, languorous sweet kirtans. So through that, japa was a very personal thing, and I don't remember a great deal of concentration or discussion between the devotees about japa. Mostly it was congregational chanting.
And the happiest time, I think, out of all the service I did for Prabhupada, the simplest thing made him the happiest. I was waiting for him to come up, and I took his Srimad Bhagavatam, 4th Canto, Part 4, and I was sitting in front of his desk, and I was just reading it, waiting for him to come up. And so that night he came up a little earlier than I expected. And so they just carried him through the circular stairs in the back. You carry him in the rocking chair. It's a tight squeeze, so only 2 people can carry him up. And they carried him right in. And as soon as I saw him, I put the book on his desk and did my obeisances. And Prabhupada asked me, "What are you reading?" And I said, "Oh, it's your Srimad Bhagavatam, Srila Prabhupada, 4th Canto, Part 4. And he just smiled like anything. And Tamal Krishna was standing there, and he said, "This is very good. He's reading in his spare time. This is very good." And so I was just like, wow, I mean, he's out there in the hot sun, 110 degrees, spraying the windows and doing all this service in the hot sun. He never said anything about that, but when he saw me reading, he was very pleased.
I did get into the massage loop. I remember when I was a fresh sannyasi in 1972, and it was the time of Janmashtami and Srila Prabhupada's appearance day in New Vrindavan in 1972. It was, I believe, August. And I think his personal servant was unable to massage him that day. So he said, "Pusta Krishna, you can give him a massage." I had never massaged anybody. I said, "So how do you do it?" He said, "Well, you start on the head with sandalwood oil, and then you do the body from head down with mustard oil." So we sat outside where Srila Prabhupada was staying in New Vrindavan, and I went behind Srila Prabhupada, offered my obeisances, and took some sandalwood oil in my hand, and started to very gently massage his head. I didn't know what I was doing. And Srila Prabhupada said, "What is this?" I said, "Well, Srila Prabhupada, I'm trying to give you a massage." He said, "Massage means hard," like that. So I figured it out that, you're supposed to massage hard, so I started rubbing his head real hard. And he was very pleased. And so I was rubbing the head with sandalwood oil, and it's hard to imagine massaging Srila Prabhupada for the first time without knowing what you're doing. And then worked on his back with the mustard seed oil and whatnot. And actually it was a very sweet experience to be able to massage Srila Prabhupada, because apart from rendering the personal service, Srila Prabhupada would sometimes talk about Krishna conscious things or business related to Krishna consciousness. And he would sometimes be amused by the way that we would massage. You would continue massaging until he said, "Go to the next part." He would massage his back and his arms. And I remember someone had told me that Srila Prabhupada liked his toes cracked. So I used to massage Srila Prabhupada's toes very hard, trying to crack his toes. Prabhupada sometimes he used to laugh. He said, "Oh, that's enough," like that. It was really kind of humorous. He was really a very kind-hearted person, and those times are very sweet.
I never ceased to be amazed at how every single time Prabhupada would tune right in and come up and relate to you and whoever was with you. One thing I never quite understood is I was a brahmachari for so many years, but my real propensity obviously wasn't to be a brahmachari, and it was a little wishful thinking on my part to think I was kind of like that, advanced, detached. But in those days, if you expressed the idea that maybe you thought you should be married, then you had someone talking you out of it, and your service was going to go to hell, and So we had a hard life trying to figure out what decisions we were supposed to take. And I would go up to see Prabhupada, on more than one occasion he would say, "Ah, Kesavaji," he said, "where is your wife?" And I said, "Prabhupada, I don't have a wife," and he would do that. It's like, even he could see I wasn't really a pucka brahmachari. And he would say that. And I knew what he was saying. He was like showing me that, you better think about things a little bit,
Generally, Prabhupada would reveal what he thought we needed to know. Some people, their nature is to ask endless questions. But I always felt like a fool asking more than what Srila Prabhupada revealed. Now, if we didn't hear properly, then Srila Prabhupada would have to ask questions, and he would have to repeat. But I found very often the same things that he taught in 1967, say even in regards to cooking, he was revealing that night, that same subject matter in 1976, so many years later. Prabhupada kept Krishna consciousness very simple. And for those of us who engaged in his service, at least my relationship was simply to hear and to follow those instructions personally.
So all these devotees would be coming, and Srup Damodar Maharaj came, and he was a little distant. This was in the morning in the garden, and there was only a couple people there, devotees. And Prabhupada asked who that was, because he was like a distance away, and I said, that's Srup Damodar Maharaj, and he said, call him over here. So he sat right by Prabhupada, and he began telling Prabhupada about his Bombay scientist preaching program they just did before he got there. And Prabhupada, before he got there, he looked a little morose to me by my material vision. But when he started talking about that scientific preaching, he just sat up like a light bulb. He was beaming, and he was pointing with his finger, and the skin was shaking off his bone. There was just a bone here, and the skin was hanging off it, and the skin was flapping. And he said, actually, I appeared in this world for two reasons: to establish Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and to defeat these rascal scientists. And you are doing this. I'm very pleased. And he just went on for a couple hours talking about this, and he wanted this very much.
There was one time we were driving from Durban to Pietermaritzburg in South Africa, and we're out in the country, and there were some big, long, white buildings some distance from the highway. And Srila Prabhupada asked, what are those buildings? And I responded that they're a chicken coop that belongs to a large chicken farm that they use as a slaughterhouse. And Srila Prabhupada said, why do they bother? Let them make a chicken. You take some egg, you put some liquid in it, you incubate it, and let them make a chicken. But they can't, those rascals, because they don't understand that the life is not in the egg, but it's the spirit soul. And he carried on for some time talking about that. It was a really very animated time.
Prabhupada had a flight to catch, and the devotees figured out, considering bad traffic and everything, that they could leave within a certain amount of time and get Prabhupada there properly. But Prabhupada insisted that they had to leave very early that day. Well, people were wondering if that is something wrong with Prabhupada, because it's only 20 minutes to the airport and the flight, and Prabhupada was literally pushing Brahmananda out the door like 2 hours before they even needed to be to the airport, and they were only 20 minutes away. And they said, okay, you're Prabhupada, you're the spiritual master. And sure enough, on the road, there had been some bad accident and some big traffic problem, and everyone on the highway was really stuck. And he only got to the flight in the nick of time, and if they had left even a few minutes after, when Prabhupada was pushing them out early, they would have missed the flight. What to speak of leaving at the normal time? That would have been it. And devotees realized at that time Prabhupada knew that they had to go early. Now, how did he know? So,
of course, Vishnujan Maharaj was a very dear devotee. He was a great friend to many of those who were introduced to Krishna consciousness by his beautiful kirtans and the traveling sankirtan parties that they had had. And his kirtans were angelic. They were heart piercing. They were beautiful. And it was a morning walk in Mayapur when I remember as we were completing the walk and we were perhaps a quarter of a mile away from the main temple building, headed back, Vishnujan Maharaj approached Srila Prabhupada and he said, if someone falls down from the sannyas position, do they have to do what Chota Haridas did in order to keep Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mercy? Prabhupada said yes. And there was some concern that no one could really commit suicide over such an issue. And Vishnujan Maharaj, following that meeting, he disappeared shortly after taking bath in the Ganges that day, and was never seen again.
So Tamal mentioned to Prabhupada that they'd been doing an investigation about where Vishnujan, they had his passport, he couldn't have left India without it, he didn't apply for a new one. Some Brahmins came to the Delhi temple and said that a white sannyasi had come to Prayag, where Chota Haridas committed suicide. And this white sannyasi paid them to take him out in a boat and chant mantras so he wouldn't take a ghost body. He tied rocks to himself and jumped off the boat. So some white Swami did that. So when they put all the pieces together, they realized that must have been Vishnujan. He hasn't been seen since. So Tamal mentioned that to Prabhupada, that we really think he did commit suicide. And he asked Prabhupada, do you know where Vishnujan is, Prabhupada? And Prabhupada began to cry. The tears came. And he said, Vishnujan is very advanced. First he said he did not have to do that. But then when he asked him, first he said, when he heard the story, he did not have to do that. And then Tamal said, Prabhupada, do you know where Vishnujan is? And he said, he's very advanced. He's still chanting Hare Krishna. He's very advanced. And then about 2 weeks later, Prabhupada, when he woke up in the morning, he said that Vishnujan was chanting to him at nighttime, like Chota Haridas came back and chanted for Lord Chaitanya.
When we arrived in London in 1968, our small party decided that the best way to become known, Prabhupada wanted us to make a splash. So the best way to become known would be reach the Beatles, because they were luminaries of the time. So we agreed that we would make prasadam dishes, apple dishes, to bring to Apple Records every day and see if we could catch someone's attention. So we did that, and the prasad went from the lower floors to the upper floors, so that ultimately everyone tasted some of that prasad, and they became a little addicted to that. So finally, when we stopped sending prasad, we were notified, where is this Apple Hare Krishna group? So we came to meet them, and ultimately I think met George that day. And the first person to strike off a serious friendship with George was Shamsunder. He and George Harrison just clicked. They were like brothers. Shamsunder used to rock back and forth. He was a tall, thin man. He used to rock back and forth. And I remember when he met George, he was rocking back and forth. And George Harrison started rocking back and forth like this. And practically their whole relationship was, I remember, like this, back and forth. Very close friends they became. But ultimately through that, George became aware of our chanting. Now Mukunda Maharaj, now then Mukunda Das, he was a musical genius, an arranger and a composer, and he was the leader of our group. We all played instruments, and he composed the melody for Govindam, and we used to go about London and do Sankirtan at various places, the Arts Lab and a macrobiotic restaurant. So we were pretty tight musically. And when George heard that we were into transcendental chanting and chanting Hare Krishna, he really wanted to hear us. And almost right away we started having really good kirtans with him at his house, and said, I want to record this. And so the first thing we did was the Hare Krishna mantra on a 45, and I believe it was Sri Krishna on the backside. That became number 1 in Czechoslovakia, was top 10, topped the pops in England. And then that led to the larger album, the Govindam album, which the lead cut was the Rama Samhita, the Govindam prayers. So Srila Prabhupada was, of course, very happy with the involvement that we were having with the Beatles. We ultimately lived at John Lennon's Tittenhurst estate for much of the fall of '69. And when Srila Prabhupada finally did arrive, he was so very pleased of this connection. I believe he called that Govindam cut a Krishna conscious symphony. This is a Krishna conscious symphony. Very transcendental. He liked that.
There's a funny story that took place in New Zealand. And of course, Srila Prabhupada, his patience could also be taxed. New Zealand was a beautiful country, of course, for Srila Prabhupada to visit, and devotees there were very mellow, very sweet. And there were a lot of families that had small children. And after the lecture one day, Srila Prabhupada asked, are there any questions? And so, one after another, these fathers and mothers would bring their children up and say, oh, Srila Prabhupada, please give a name to my child. And so he gave one name and then another name, and it would go on, and finally someone asked Srila Prabhupada, please give a name to my daughter, and he said, Rose. And I think his patience had been tested at that point.
But one morning, I got everything set up, turned the fountain on, and then I noticed there was one little bush in his garden that had 4 little white flowers on it. So I thought, well, I'll pick these and put them on his Vyasa-san. And I put them on the pillow there. As soon as he sat down, he picked them up and started smelling them. And he held them the whole 2 hours there. Then the next morning, when he sat down, I was standing there and he put his hand out to me, and I thought, oh, he wants flowers. But that little bush isn't going to have any more flowers because I picked them all yesterday. So he didn't say anything, but I knew that I should go look for those flowers, look at the bush. And I went over there, and to my surprise, there was 8 flowers on that little plant. It was just 1 foot by a little teeny plant. And I went, wow, so I picked the 8 flowers, and I took them back, gave them to Prabhupada. And he smelled them, and then he said, simply by smelling this particular type of flower, which is like a little white Pakaki or Mogra, I'm not sure exactly what the name was, but it looks like a small gardenia, a little white flower. He said it smelled really good. Simply by smelling this particular type of flower, it regulates your life errors. So, Prabhupada saw a reason for everything. He didn't do it for sense gratification. He offered it to Krishna's, energy. And then every day after that, this little bush would produce, a whole bunch of flowers. So I'd put them there every day, and Prabhupada would smell them every day. And so that was a pretty mystical. Another one of the things that proved to me that Krishna was directly protecting Prabhupada and providing for him.
With regard to Srila Prabhupada meeting his godbrothers, it was in, I think, March or April of 1976, when Srila Prabhupada asked me to travel across to Navadvip to pick up Srila Sridhar Maharaj, to bring him over to meet with Srila Prabhupada at the Mandir in Mayapur. And it was a very glorious time. There were so many devotees there for the festival. And we had just purchased, actually, from the South Africa Yatra, 1 Mercedes for Srila Prabhupada. And we had driven it across overland. And At that time, Srila Prabhupada had asked me also to stay on as his secretary at the Mayapur festival. So we drove over to Navadvip. It was a long drive, and went to the Sri Chaitanya Saraswat Mat. And I remember going upstairs, and Srila Sridhar Maharaj was sitting there. Very old gentleman, a little bit older than Srila Prabhupada. He was chanting japa, and I offered my respects and obeisances and invited him into the car. And we took him over to meet Srila Prabhupada. And we brought him upstairs to Srila Prabhupada's room, and he and Srila Prabhupada were very, very close. There was no doubt about it. They were very, very dear friends. And they offered their obeisances to each other, and it was clear that they had a very special relationship.
And in the course of moving the deities, I believe each man two per deity, I was following. One of them knocked, the curtains were closed, we were behind adjusting the deities, and one of the persons, somehow or another, inadvertently knocked one of these columns with their elbow. And in as fast as an accident happens in an automobile going 70 miles an hour, everything slowed down into slow motion. And I remember watching this column go out with the speed of lightning. Srila Prabhupada moved all of the paraphernalia with his right hand off the bottom granite step, stepped up with his right foot on the first step, his left foot on the second step, grabbed one column, this huge column, the column was at least 6 to 8 inches in diameter, with his right hand, and Radharani's hand with his left hand. And I saw on his brow little beads of perspiration, the first time I had ever seen him perspire. And this was such a chivalrous thing that Srila Prabhupada did that I understood what the rasa of chivalry was. And he had that in protecting Radharani. Well, that's one example of Srila Prabhupada exhibiting a very personal rasa with Krishna, actually saving Radharani from disaster and exhibiting superhuman strength and the alacrity of the movement of the mind. It couldn't have been faster.
In Australia, it had, as Srila Prabhupada's secretary, come to my attention through some rumors in the temple that there were some ISKCON devotees who were really displeased with the success that Siddhaswarupananda Maharaj had had preaching in Hawaii, and how the followers that he had gathered were not all coming over to Srila Prabhupada, so to speak. And of course, Siddhaswarupananda Maharaj was using Srila Prabhupada's books, and chanting the holy name was a key focus for his work. And of course, the details I'll leave out because they involve people that there's no need to mention in this context. But when I mentioned it to Srila Prabhupada in private, Srila Prabhupada raised his eyebrows and said, "That is Vaishnava Aparad," meaning it is Vaishnava Aparad against Siddhaswarupananda Maharaj. And he qualified it by saying that there are many branches of the tree of Mahaprabhu. And Prabhupada said this with all humility, that ISKCON is not the only branch of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's tree, and that we need to develop a tolerance for other branches of Mahaprabhu that may develop both then and in the future.
Did Prabhupada really love his disciples? What kind of love was it? How would you understand it? And I knew that Prabhupada had a real type of love, a special love for disciples. And I knew also that Prabhupada didn't show favorites. A lot of people thought that. A lot of people thought there was favoritism circumstantially, not intentionally. But I knew Prabhupada got so much satisfaction or relief out of the little child that brought the flower, out of the devotee that was humble and not on the front lines, you know. And I knew that it was distributed evenly. His affection, his benediction, his blessings were evenly distributed.
At about 7 o'clock, Prabhupada's car pulled up in front of the temple, and you know, I knew he couldn't walk anymore. I don't know if most of the devotees didn't know it was that serious. So we had a rocking chair at the car ready, and he got in the rocking chair, and he said, "Take me to see the deities." So we carried him up in front of Yasodanandan was there, Swami. He was a Swami at the time. And he used to, you probably told this story, but he used to carry Prabhupada a lot because he's so strong. We used to try to get the strongest devotees. And so he carried him in front of Gaur Nitai, and Prabhupada stood up, and he, did his respects, and tears began to come down his cheeks, and stood there for a few minutes, and then he started to sit down, and somebody had taken the chair away. And so he almost fell, you know, so Tamal Krishna had, you know, the other devotee had to support him. And so, get that chair back here. So we got the chair back, and then the devotees were all looking at each other like, wow, you know, Prabhupada is sick. So then he went over to Krishna Balaram altar, and he stood up again. Of course, this time the chair was held there. And again, tears came down his cheeks, and then he went over to Radha Shamasundar and Lalita and Vishaka, and gazed at them for a while, and then he turned and he said, "I want to see all the devotees in my room." So we carried him into his room, sat behind his desk, and all the devotees packed into the room. And of course there wasn't enough room for all the devotees, and they were like looking in the doors and in the windows and crawling up on each other, and everywhere you looked all you seen was devotees. And Prabhupada began to say that, "So I have come here to leave my body, but you should not lament, because I've given you everything in my books, and if you simply read my books and cooperate with your god brothers, everything will go on nicely." And the devotees at that time, half of them began to cry, "Oh no, Prabhupada, you can't leave us." And Prabhupada just said the same thing over and over. "I am in my books, read my books, cooperate."
Krishna Kirtana Gana Natana Pano Premamritam Manidhi Viradhi